Thank you. Hi, my name is Chris Soria. I'm a PhD student here in the Department of Demography, and it's my pleasure to introduce Joel Mittleman. Joel Mittleman is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Notre Dame, where he is also a faculty affiliate of the Center for Research on Educational Opportunity and the Gender Studies program. As a sociologist and social demographer, he studies inequality with a focus on LGBTQ populations. And also, Joel had an op-ed piece in the Washington Post last week that has gathered some attention. Maria will link it in the chat for those who are interested in reading that. We're all very excited to have you, Professor Mittleman, and look forward to your presentation.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you, Aisha, my old office mate, for the invitation. I guess I'll share my screen here. Okay, am I all set in terms of the presentation? You can see me?
Looks good, Joel.
Okay. All right, great. So, yeah, so as was mentioned, this piece came out last week and the American Sociological Review came out online. And I was completely unprepared for what a big reaction it would occasion. So I've had the strange experience of getting to write an op-ed for the Washington Post and talking to a whole bunch of reporters, but you are the first academic audience that I get to talk to about the work. So I'm so grateful for that. And I'm grateful especially that I get to talk to a group of demographers about it. Because in addition to the substantive story about educational inequality among LGB Americans, I also hope that, part of the piece is a broader story about the changing landscape of population data on queer populations in the United States, and also the importance of studying queer populations as demographers, not just because they're important in their own right, but because they reveal certain, they provide I think a unique perspective on long established demographic trends. So here I'll be talking about one such trend, which is the gender gap in education. So for the talk, I'm gonna do some very brief background. I was told to talk for about 30 minutes, so I'll move briskly through the background. So I'll be talking about the academic gender gap, and then the invisibility of sexuality in education research. Then I'll move into presenting two studies, two complementary studies that make use of a variety of new data sources. Then I'll present some robustness checks to try to convince you that you should believe my results, that they're not something about the way in which sexuality is being reported, rather it's really something about sexuality itself. And then once I've hopefully convinced you of that, I'll give my interpretations of what I think is going on with the results that I find. So I'll start by talking about the academic gender gap. So some of you may have seen this unexpectedly viral article from the Wall Street Journal this past September, announcing that a generation of American men has given up on college. Right. So this article announced that, spurred by the pandemic, men are now abandoning higher education in such numbers that they trail women by record levels. At the close of the most recent academic year, it's about a 60-40 split in higher education between women and men. And the kind of headline takeaway here was that if current trends continue, 2 women would soon earn a college degree for every 1 man. And so this article was accompanied by a whole set of other articles announcing this fact, that the pandemic has accelerated this trend of a growing female favorable gender gap in higher education. So we see that from the Hechinger report. The New York Times announced that the rising gender gap in education might be one of the most transformative trends of our time. The Atlantic succinctly offered that colleges have a guy problem. So, of course, this is not a new story, though. Although the pandemic changed the magnitude of the gap itself has been growing for a long time. So all the way back in 2006, Newsweek magazine on its cover announced that we had a boy crisis in education, that at every level of education, boys are falling behind. And, you know, beyond the popular press, this topic of the rising gender gap has received a number of academic treatments. For sociologists and demographers, we're probably familiar with Tom DePreet and Claudia Buckman's great book, The Rise of Women. So to showcase these trends, here I'm presenting the 2018 American Community Survey. So among American adults age 25 and older, what do the birth cohort trends look like? All right. And so here we see the rise of women, this established demographic trend. And there's two components that are interesting here. So one is the monotonic rise of women's education over 20th century birth cohorts. So for each birth cohort from the 1960 onward, women have had a growing advantage over men in college completion. But the other thing that's arguably even more interesting is the fact that men's college completion rates have been basically stagnant over this whole period. And so at a time when the economic return to a college education has been steadily growing, men have been resistant in terms of accepting these economic incentives, such that men born after 1980 are just slightly more likely than men born before 1950 to have a college degree. So this college trend is indicative of a broader gender gap in education, where we see that on most measures, women now outpace men in terms of school success. So we see this all the way from kindergarten up through programs of doctoral study. So women now outpace men in terms of rates of earning PhDs, MDs, and JDs. But of course, there's a couple important exceptions here. So it's no longer the case that men at the average outperform women in math tests, but it is the case that in certain more advantaged school districts that remains true. And of course, there's a few persistently male-dominated fields, you know, at the level of higher education. Famously, certain STEM fields, but all those things like philosophy and music composition are just massively male-dominated. But these kind of remaining areas of male domination should not distract us from the broader picture in which women overall outpace men. So faced with these patterns, you know, sociologists want to emphasize the social dynamics of gender as opposed to the purported dictates of biological sex. And so the way in which they've tried to illustrate that, you know, the gender gap is not always and everywhere the same thing, inevitably as a function of biology. Instead, it varies tremendously by social group and social context, right? So the sociological move has been to emphasize heterogeneity across birth cohort, obviously, also family resources, race, ethnicity, school context. And across these studies, what we're doing is we're trying to find basically the areas where boys do almost as well as women, right? In none of these are we really showing kind of big patterns of male advantage. But importantly, within this literature, there's been one critical axis of variation that has been invisible in all the data sets that we've been using to study education at the population level, and that's sexuality. So let me say a bit more about the invisibility of sexuality in education research. So in 2015, the American Education Research Association brought together a group of scholars to try to do a survey of the field of, you know, what's the state of education research on queer students. And the conclusion that George Wemberly, the editor, writes is that there's limited education research with representative samples of LGBTQ students. That what exists in the literature is mostly an accumulation of narratives. and that data limitations have made it impossible to link LGBTQ status with students' educational outcomes, things like student achievement, high school graduation, earning of degrees, the kind of hallmark topics of research on educational inequality. So this absence of education research is indicative of a broader context where sexuality has been largely invisible in population data. So a recent review found that over 100 ongoing federally sponsored surveys, only 11 assess sexual orientation in the United States. And so you might be saying, but wait, I've seen articles over the years. And so one thing that researchers have done is that they use the same-sex partnerships that are reported in the household rosters of the big demographic surveys like the Decennial Census and the American Community Survey. But this is, critically important research has been done in this way, and yet it's also research that has important limitations, especially for studying education, because you're only getting a selective subset of the gay and lesbian population if you're using, my dog is barking, I'm sorry. So you're only getting a selective subset of the gay and lesbian population if you're selecting based on partnership. And given the stratification of cohabitation by education, it may be a systematically unrepresentative population, right? And then the other thing is that it totally obscures the bisexual population if you're just selecting on same-sex partnerships. So there are a number of commonly used data sets that do have direct measures of sexual orientation, sexual identity, or sexual attraction or behavior that don't have the limitations of partnership data, and yet they too face some important limitations. So for example, they'll be only representative of certain states in the case of the Burfus data, or representative of only certain age ranges, as in Ed Health or NHANES or National Study of Family Growth. And then the other thing is that these data sets, with the exception of Burfus, all have pretty small sample sizes. So for example, the GSS has been asking about sexual identity since 2008. But even if you pool across all available waves of that data, you get only a little over 10,000 respondents, yielding a sample of only 115 gay men and 94 lesbian women. So what this does is it gives you unstable estimates of the kind of overall population, but it also critically limits your ability to look at variation within those populations. And so given that data landscape, I'm so sorry about my dog. So given that data landscape, existing research on LGB education has been limited in important ways, and it's been characterized by these inconsistent conclusions that even studies using the same data set. So for example, there's a lot of good research. A generation of research was done using the Ed Health data set on queer populations generally, and also on educational outcomes specifically. But depending on the wave that studies used and depending on the measure of sexual orientation that they were using, they came to directly opposite conclusions about the nature of disparities. So we have these important limitations and inconsistent conclusions. So fortunately, the landscape of data has been changing a lot recently. So I'm presenting two studies here that take advantage of new data. So first, I'm going to be presenting on the educational attainment of the whole US population of adults. And then I'm going to complement that with a more detailed analysis of a recent cohort of high school students. So let me tell you a bit more about the data. So I have these three large nationally representative household surveys, and then the first two and only two US Department of Education longitudinal cohort studies that have ever asked about student sexual orientation. So the three surveys may be familiar to some of you. So I'm using the National Health Interview Survey, National Survey of Drug Use and Health, and the National Crime Victimization Survey. All right. And then I'm going to be using the High School Longitudinal Survey of 2009, and the Baccalaureate and Beyond Longitudinal Study of 2016-2017. So just to put up, so I use every available year, every year that these surveys asked about sexual orientation, I pool across them. And so for every one of these surveys, I'm getting a sample size that's more than 10 times larger what's available, for example, in the GSS. And then I'm complementing it with this recent high school cohort study. And then the other survey I use for robustness checks. And then just to say another nice thing about having these multiple studies that I'm replicating across is that I'm not just replicating across different surveys, but the surveys themselves use different ways of assessing sexual identity. So in the National Health Interview Survey, for example, respondents were asked face-to-face in an interview what their sexual identity was, whereas in the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, it was completed privately on a laptop that was provided. So I'm not just replicating across different surveys, but different ways of assessing sexual identity. So, all right. So for the first study, I look at multiple levels of educational attainment, but the results I'll be presenting here are on BA attainment. So I'm going to look overall by race, ethnicity, and by birth cohort. And the results I'll be presenting are average adjusted predictions or marginal effects from logistic regressions. But a nice thing is that the purely descriptive results show the same exact story. So, all right, so let's get into results. So here I'm presenting across these three surveys, the educational attainment for adult, non-institutionalized civilian American men by sexual orientation. And you'll forgive the, I'm going to be presenting graphs in blues and pinks. And for a study on queering our understanding of the gender gap, blue and pink is an unfortunate choice in a way, but I also am going to be presenting a lot of graphs, and I think that blue and pink is so ingrained in our heads that I think it kind of helps intuitively center what we're looking at. So, okay, so what we find well replicated almost to the point estimate across these surveys is a fairly striking pattern of gay men just completely towering over all other groups of men. And so to just put this in context a bit, I estimate that about 52% of American gay men have a college degree. And to put that in context, about 36% of Americans overall have a college degree, which ranks us ninth in educational attainment in the world. But if America's gay men form their own country, would be by far the most highly educated country in the world. The current leader is Luxembourg with 46%. So we blow them out of the water with the educational attainment here. So just a really high pattern of educational attainment for gay men. Moving to lesbian women, well, to all the women by sexuality. We find that lesbian women too, again, well replicated across cohorts or across data sets. Lesbian women too outpace the other groups. So bring the things together, we see both at the population level overall, both gay men and lesbian women have higher levels of education. But gay men have the highest of all groups.
Can I just ask, for women where the educational attainment is changing so much by cohort, how does that affect the picture?
Great. So I'm going to present by birth cohort in a sec.
Just when we compare, it looks like the effects are bigger for men than for women. I would have expected the other way around because of the younger cohorts. There can be even bigger differences for. I'm assuming that the age of lesbian women is younger on average than.
Yeah, so So it is true that there's a slight cohort trend. So this is important. The real challenge is with bisexual identification. So there's a very sharp cohort trend in younger cohorts of women, but not men, reporting higher levels of bisexual identification. But gay and lesbian identification is actually rather stable across birth cohorts and has been since the 60s.
And what we're looking at here is the aggregate of all people over 25, or is this with lots of controls for cohorts?
So this is controlling for race, ethnicity, nativity, and birth cohort. But the descriptive pattern is effectively the same.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so, but you're anticipating lots of important issues here, so thank you. All right, so then moving to race ethnicity. Okay, so here, rather than presenting the full set of levels, because it's a lot with 3 data sets and 6 groups, I'm going to be presenting the average marginal effects of the 3-way interaction of sex, bisexuality by race ethnicity. And so first, comparing gay men and straight men, what you'll see is that in every racial ethnic group that I can measure with sufficient sample sizes, there's a persistent advantage across groups, right? Among white men, black men, Hispanic men, Asian men. Some of them fall a little bit short of statistical significance, but across all these groups, the pattern is clear. Less so among the groups that I have to bring together under other, but I'm really starting to strain the sample sizes there, even as I have these comparatively massive sample sizes by the standards of the literature. So for gay men, this overall advantage emerges across groups. Switching to lesbian women, we see that a big advantage here among white women, but for every other group, the pattern is totally inconsistent, right? Well, inconsistent / there's no clear advantage. So that overall population average advantage for lesbian women appears to be concentrated almost entirely among white women. For bisexual disparities, there's little clear pattern. Just to underscore again, the difference, we have gay men with a consistent advantage across all groups that I can measure well, and lesbian women concentrated within the white women, right? Okay, and then for the last thing, breaking down by cohort. So a complexity with the cohort analysis is exactly the concern that was raised of, isn't there changing cohort patterns in identification? And I do see some of that a little bit in the earliest cohorts for gay and lesbian identification, but it's been steady since the 1960s. The big challenge here is this massive growth in bisexual identification among younger cohorts of women. So given that, I'm going to focus first on just the straight gay lesbian comparison. And so focusing first here's in the National Health Interview Survey, we see that here we replicate this pattern of the rise of women, right? So we see that for each birth cohort since 1960, straight women have increasingly outpaced straight men. And yet when we bring sexuality into the picture, we see that from the perspective of the gay and lesbian population, there's a very different story here. So just to hone in, we see that gay men have consistently outpaced straight men across birth cohorts, whereas lesbian women historically had this advantage, but it's declined both as a result of straight women's rising attainments and lesbian women's seeming decline in attainment. So that's from the National Health Interview Survey. And again, I replicate that well across each of the other surveys. So for the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, the first cohort gets a little wonky, but in general, the pattern is well replicated across cohorts. Then, because of the issue of the bisexual trend and identification, I present the bisexual results just for contemporary cohorts. So here, I'm taking the sample that's just born post-1980, and I'm Additionally, in addition to my 3 household data sets, I'm also presenting the high school longitudinal cohort study here in terms of the students would be juniors at the time of the most recent wave. So it's not completion, but it's whether they're enrolled in a 4-year university pursuing a BA. So again, we have well-replicated pattern into the current cohorts. Gay men continue to tower over other men. The little bit of an inconsistent pattern for bisexuals. And then among women, again, it's a well-replicated pattern. And what we see is that the overall advantage that lesbian women had in the earlier graphs is now entirely gone in the most recent cohorts. And so, for both of these, we see, again, going into this separate high school longitudinal survey, a well-replicated pattern of gay men continuing success, and then this gradient among women. So to summarize, and I'm mindful of time, I think I'm taking longer than I anticipated. So gay men just have this persistent, pervasive, strikingly high pattern of attainment. Lesbian women have an overall advantage, but on closer examination, it's concentrated entirely among white women and older birth cohorts. Bisexuals are roughly at parity overall, but they're disadvantaged in the most recent cohorts, particularly among women. But the interpretation here is really complicated by the rise of bisexual identification among young women. All right, so now I shift to the high school longitudinal survey, which since the 1970s, the US Department of Education has been doing these longitudinal surveys of high school students. And so for the 5th and most recent one of these, in the most recent wave of the survey, they asked for the first time ever for one of these surveys, student sexuality. So using that data, I'm able to look at 4 domains of outcomes. So instead of just these binary attainment measures, we look at attainment, achievement and course taking, so GPA. This I get from their official transcripts. Then I have a variety of measures of behaviors and attitudes. And then I supplement that with measures of discrimination and stress. So to situate their academic outcomes within the broader experience of school. And here, I'm going to just present the average marginal effect of sex bisexuality, and I have richer controls here. So I'm able to control for family SES based on parent income and parent education, and also high school fixed effects. But again, the table of purely descriptive statistics gives you the same story as the regression adjusted results. So I'll move briskly through these for the sake of time. So, okay, so here I'm going to be presenting gay versus straight, lesbian versus straight disparities, first for attainment. So whether they're currently enrolled for a BA, whether they got a high school diploma, and whether they ever report dropping out of high school, where dropping out is measured as leaving high school for more than 4 weeks at a time, not for vacation or illness. So you see for gay men, this advantage continues. So they're about 18 percentage points more likely to be currently enrolled for a BA than straight men. And again, that's like a huge disparity. So to contextualize it, the overall male-female gender gap is about 9 percentage points. So it's, the gay men versus straight men disparity is double the size of the overall male-female disparity. But for lesbian women, we find a largely reverse pattern, particularly with high school dropout. Then looking at GPA, so high school GPA, and then among those who continued on to college, their undergraduate, cumulative undergraduate GPA, and then the intensity of coursework. Again, we see gay men's advantage all across, and lesbian women's broad pattern of disadvantage. This persists also on self-reported measures of how hard they try in school, the amount of time they're spending on their homework, how often they show up to class late, things like that, what I'm calling effort and behavior. attitudes about how important school is for future success, like whether they disagree with the statement that school is often a waste of time, and then the kind of academic orientation of who they say their close friends are. So how many of their close friends are planning to go to college? How many of their close friends have taken the SAT? On this, we see again this divide where gay men's advantage and lesbian women's disadvantage. But then finally, an important part of the study that I want to draw out is that I contextualize these academic patterns within the broader social experience of high school. And so I also have these reports of whether they report in ninth grade that they feel unsafe in school, whether they report that discrimination has limited their educational opportunities, and whether they report that they've ever had trouble concentrating because of mental health problems. And for all of these patterns, all these outcomes, we see that the divide between gay men and lesbian women is gone. So both groups have these elevated levels of discrimination and stress. So just briefly moving to the bisexual disparities, we see that whereas there's this divide between gay men and lesbian women, for bisexuals, they pattern largely follows one another. So across outcomes, I'm going to show a broad pattern of disadvantage, particularly for women. And again, it's complicated by the fact that women report much higher rates of bisexuality than men. But they too, for every group, even though we have these, big divides in terms of the academic patterns, for the broader social picture of feeling safe in school and the way that you feel that discrimination and mental health has impacted your academic experience, we see similarities across groups. So to summarize the second study, gay men's advantages continue into a wide range, into the recent cohort and a wide range of outcomes. Lesbian women's historic advantages are entirely gone, although it's not the case that every outcome is statistically significant. In general, it's characterized by a broad pattern of disadvantage. Bisexuals as well have these disadvantages, particularly among women, and yet all the groups, despite their very different academic outcomes, report elevated rates of discrimination and minority stress. Okay. So I've presented these results. Let me just quickly convince you of their robustness. So, so the first thing I do, you may be concerned I'm using measures of sexual identity. And so you might think that conditional on the unobservable, infinite variation of human sexuality, perhaps there's something about who's selecting a kind of gay identity measure, that maybe there's something about the identity measure itself that is educationally stratified. And so I replicate using an attraction measure. And then a critical concern is that, you might worry, given these huge patterns of gay men's advantage, that maybe it's the case that college-educated men are more willing to come out, even on an anonymous survey. And so I could be selecting on the dependent variable of college completion from a larger closeted population. So I'm going to address both of these concerns. So first of all, just quickly with the National Study of Drug Use and Health amazingly included this measure of sexual attraction alongside identity that gives 5 options. And so what you see, it's kind of cool just as a measure of the demography of sexuality in America, that within every identity group, it's true that people report a variety of attraction types. This is true among men and even more so among women. So, these two measures of sexuality are obviously related, but they're not purely reducible to one another. So it would be reassuring if we found similar patterns using an identity measure. And indeed, that's exactly what we find. So replicating here, breaking groups down by mostly are only attracted to the other sex, mostly are only attracted to the same sex, or equally attracted, we get the same picture as we did, not just overall, but also by race, ethnicity, and by birth cohort. So using this attraction measure, I replicate the results well. Other concern about this college-educated men being more willing to come out, I'd emphasize that, we're talking about coming out even on a privately completed anonymous survey, and yet even so, you could have that concern. And so in the paper, I go at this a couple different ways, but the way that I find most convincing is I draw on this entirely separate study that's nationally representative sample of students who completed a bachelor's degree in the United States in 2015, 2016. And from that, I have official GPAs from college transcripts and sexual identification from a baseline survey. And what I show is that even within this sample, gay men substantially outpace straight men. Lesbian women have a, meaningful but not statistically significant disadvantage, and bisexuals are roughly at par with their peers. So even within this sample that, again, given how, according to the Wall Street Journal, men are abandoning higher education. So this is a select group of people who not just enrolled, but successfully completed higher education. Even within that group, gay men surpass straight men by a large margin. And so to give a sense of the effect size, the GPA advantage that gay men have is about 3 times larger than the advantage associated with having a college-educated parent in the data. So, all right, so I've replicated bisexuality or by attraction, and I've addressed the concern about selecting on the dependent variable. So let me wrap up by saying what I think is going on here. So, all right, so what do I have to explain? So for gay men, we have this tremendous persistent advantage. Lesbian women, historically, there's an advantage for white women, but in contemporary cohorts, there's a broad pattern of disadvantage. Then for bisexuals, they're roughly at parity, but substantial disadvantages in contemporary cohorts. So let me first say about the bisexuals, because I think that my explanation is the least satisfying for this group. So what I would say is that the educational pattern that I've documented here is directly consistent with research in a variety of other domains like labor market outcomes and health, both physical and mental health. So in those domains as here, the bisexual population is disadvantaged, not just compared to the straight population, but to gay and lesbian populations as well. I would just, from my perspective, especially since I'm analyzing trends over cohorts, I think a certain humility is required in terms of interpreting exactly what's going on, given that the social dynamics of bisexual identification are clearly shifting rapidly in a particularly patterned way among women, but not men. So more research is needed here. So, all right, so lesbian women's results. So historically, so I have to explain the historic advantage and current disadvantage. So I think that lesbian women, their historic advantage provides a new perspective on some established demographic trends. So we know that women's education in America and other Western countries was long externally constrained, right? So there were legal barriers and cultural norms that forced this choice between marriage and family on the one hand and higher education and careers. This is a story that's been told before. And then those patterns were reinforced by the fact that limited access to contraceptive technology meant that women's educational careers were often cut short, right? And so we have this established demographic fact that for most of the 20th century, never married women had much higher rates of college completion than married women. And I think what the lesbian women are showing us is that a lot of those never married women may have not married because marriage only meant marriage to a man, right? And so now we have a kind of new perspective on this established trend. So I think under this historical gender regime, there's lots of reasons you can imagine why lesbian women would have persisted in education while straight women were made to stop, right? And yet, I still have to explain what's going on with only white women. under that kind of gender regime, it would only be the most relatively advantaged women, who I would imagine disproportionately white women, who would have had the resources to actually capitalize on those reasons for continuing on in higher education. So this is what I make of the historical picture. The contemporary picture, so I think it's intuitive, makes sense that as the constraints on women's education decrease, that straight women would catch up with lesbian women. That if women's education is broadly constrained by patriarchy, and some of the mechanisms of that were felt less immediately by lesbian women, that as that was constrained, as those constraints ease, we'd have this catch up. But what's confusing is these broad patterns of disadvantage that we now see, with worse grades, more negative attitudes, the higher rates of dropout, most troublingly. So, I think, to be honest about what I can say with the data, it's something of a puzzle about what's going on here. I would say that so these academic disadvantages that I'm showing are consistent with other research on contemporary lesbian girls' overrepresentation in exclusionary school discipline, so suspensions and expulsions, and also a pretty shocking overrepresentation in juvenile incarceration. Lesbian girls are based on censuses of juvenile detention facilities. Lesbian girls are way overrepresented compared to what you would expect in the population. And so one suspicion I have is that there's a role for discriminatory treatment toward masculine presenting girls here. That girls who have a more masculine gender expression, qualitative research suggests, are viewed as troublemakers or somehow suspicious. And consistent with that, I show in this data new evidence that lesbian girls, particularly lesbian girls of color, overrepresented in school discipline. And then finally, let me explain gay men's results as best I can. So there's two questions. So one is, why do gay men outpace straight men? And then the other is, why do gay men outpace straight women? The latter is a more difficult question because straight men set a low bar, so it's easy to get over that bar. Both of them, I think, have to do with not just homophobia, but masculinity, right? And the cost and constraints of American masculinity. So on this question of why do they outpace straight men, we have a long history in sociology going back to Coleman of these ethnographies of adolescent boys and their experiences in and around schools, and the way that masculinity, norms of masculinity are constructed so as to constrain boys' engagement in education. So Ed Morris wrote a great, relatively recent book on this. He says that the boys in his research approach education casually. They didn't want to be seen as caring too much about doing well in school, because discourses at both schools define such behavior as consistent with masculinity. So they didn't take this approach because they were male. They did it to demonstrate manhood. And so for gay men, if the local culture of masculinity is kind of anti-academic, suppresses academic achievement, then being alienated from that culture could be socially detrimental, but academically it could be hugely beneficial. So I think that, and in the paper, I do some work to try to demonstrate this empirically, that gay men's alienation from the kind of straight culture of masculinity goes some way in explaining their academic advantages. But why do they outpace straight women, right? So if it's just about masculinity, then you wouldn't, if it's just about avoiding the issues of masculinity, the pitfalls of masculinity, then you wouldn't necessarily think they would then substantially outpace straight women as well. So here I draw on this idea called the best little boy in the world hypothesis, based on a book, 1973 memoir by Andrew Tobias, originally written under a pseudonym, of a memoir of being a gay boy in a straight world, that argues that the idea is that young closeted men deflect attention from their sexuality by investing in recognized markers of success, good grades, athletic achievement, elite employment, And so this Adam Chandler is a Rhodes Scholar who had a coming out essay in 2013 where he was reflecting on this. And he says, by the time I reached Yale Law School, more than half of the men in my randomly assigned small group seminar were gay. And when I put my study on Twitter last week, it just had this really unexpected, it just resonated so much. And so a number of the people who tweeted it had their own kind of testimonies about this best little boy effect, even though they didn't put it in those words. And so I thought that this captured it well, both the nature of the effect, but also kind of the tragedy of the effect. That on the one hand, there's a real resilience that should be celebrated, and that I think is massively underappreciated. And yet it's a resilience that's also born of a real pain of the cost of growing up in a homophobic society. So I thought I would end. I had a chance to add to the annals of op-eds about the current academic gender gap. I had a student, it was one of my favorite students I've had at Notre Dame, who's now at Berkeley Law. So I thought I would end with his quote. I thought he captured the issue a couple of years ago when I had him in class and told him about this research. He said, I realized early on, I couldn't change the fact that I was gay, but I could change how much I studied for my math test. So I thought that really captured this best little boy effect. So I think I've gone over time. I've captured all the things. I thank you very much. Hopefully we still have some time for questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen, I think.
It's really wonderful, Joel. We do have a few minutes for questions. So I'm gonna just call on folks. So Danya, do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful talk, Joel. I find these, findings super interesting. I had a very specific question about another alternative explanation, and maybe there's some data to look into it more. So beyond it being the role of masculinity, and I totally buy that masculinity can be a constraining force on academic achievement just by steering people away from taking school seriously. But I was also wondering about maybe some of the protective factors of having a just more limited opportunity for romance in early childhood, of relationships, having a smaller dating pool, having less of the drama that is associated with breakups and stuff at a young age. But also, the very different odds of, for instance, getting someone pregnant, which is a classic, reason for why someone has to drop out of high school. So I was wondering if you had any data on, whether these respondents have, been involved in a pregnancy and whether they dated in high school.
Okay, I think that those are both good alternative explanations. I don't have any, this is a critical, short answer is I don't have any data on that. I mean, for everything that I have, there's so much more that I don't. I mean, I don't even know if the people are out in their day-to-day lives. I could probably, there is probably something that I could look at about pregnancies. I haven't looked at that. Yeah, so that's an important area for future research.
Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna do one more question from the seminar room. So Josh, you wanna go ahead?
Oh, I wanted to ask about whether it might be that sexuality triggers an interest in education. I mean, just kind of like an outsider is interested in learning more about the world. You have the super achievement of some ethnic groups, the immigrant groups. Is there something where education might provide a higher return to gay people because, or maybe particularly gay men, because it enables them to understand the world they live in? They have more of a desire to understand the world they live in.
Yeah, I wonder, that being kind of outsiders in a way, that there's a certain kind of intrinsic satisfaction that comes with higher education and, being a student of your society because you feel somehow set apart from it. I know that's often appealed to explain why Jews have higher rates of education. So yeah, there could be some of that, but
I guess the data question might be, can you look in the, I don't know, do they have major field of study or something like that?
yeah, so they do. In the baccalaureate and beyond, there's information on major. The one thing that I confirmed is that gay men and lesbian women have gender atypical majors on average, but that's the only thing I looked at. There's, if any grad students or any, there's so much that could be looked at in all these data sets, but especially the baccalaureate and beyond, I've barely scratched the surface of what could be done.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joel. I apologize to others who had a question. We're at time, so we're going to end because Joel is going to stick around for a little bit longer to talk to our grad students. So let's all thank Joel again for his wonderful talk.
Thank you so much.